Welcome back to the archives for the National Open Round 3. This is the under 2100 section. I'm sitting at 1 out of 2 up to this point. And in round 3, my opponent, Ethan Gou, rated 1953. At the time of the supplement, though, I believe the sheet had him at like 1850, 1860, and had me right around 2000. And so even though the most current ratings actually have us right around the same or even him a little higher, we at the time would have thought that he had the rate disadvantage. That will play a slight role later on. Okay, so jumping into the game, I had white. I played e4, and we get a Najdorf. And we reach this position right here where white has many of options. I decided to try something new with rook to g1. Looking to play g4 and be aggressive, maybe kick this knight. Don't let black time to kind of complete all of their usual development and get their pieces to ideal squares. He thought for a moment here and then played b5, g4, bishop b7, and f3, protecting my pawns, and I can think about whether or not I really want to play e5 or g5 at some point. Played knight to c6, bishop e3, and e6, and I thought this was a pretty normal position at this point. And I captured on c6. I didn't see a great way to stop him from playing his knight into e5, which looked like it was going to be annoying. So I went ahead and made this exchange, and I considered maybe my bishop would like to be on the d4 square. I would just like to keep his knight out of e5 since f3 is a bit tender, and I don't really have a great pawn to attack that square with, since if I ever push the f-pawn, both g4 and e4 become weaker. So I played g5, and I felt like g5 was a bit of a mistake at the time. I didn't really gain anything from it, and we can see that this knight is going to be forced back. And after it's forced back, they're going to reroute themselves to the e5 square where they want to be anyway. I just said we want to keep their knight out of there, and then I forced their knight to kind of go to that square. Even though this gets me some space on the king side, this pawn could be a little bit overextended later on. I play queen to d2, and as expected, they play knight to e5. And here I think the most principled thing to do would be to simply develop my bishop to e2. Maybe g2 is a consideration, but e2 is a pretty normal developing move in the Sicilian when you've got a pawn on f3. Maybe even d3 at some point later, but at this point, they are threatening this royal fork. I played the move queen to f2, and I thought this was kind of clever. I thought my queen had some possibilities of pushing the f4 pawn, controlling the dark squares over here on the queen side, and I thought that I might be getting a good position. I underestimated the next series of moves, though. They played b4. My knight went back to e2, and they played knight to c4. I saw this coming, and I responded with knight to d4. So I'm hitting their bishop, which is loose. They are hitting my bishop. They are hitting the b2 pawn, and I'm also hitting their knight. So this is a position where I expected black to take some time and really figure out what was going on, but they played their move relatively quickly. Played knight takes e3. And now the big decision for white is, do we capture the bishop or do we capture the knight? So take a moment, think about it yourself. You can pause the video. Which piece should white capture? In the game, I played the move knight captures c6, which is the wrong one. Instead, white should simply capture on e3, and this is a very even position. Black has the bishop pair, but their king, no matter whether it stays in the center or goes kingside, is going to be under some pressure. My king should be able to get safe on the queen side. I don't think these pawns are too scary. So a pretty balanced position, especially if I'm able to trade this knight off for one of the bishops afterwards. So this would have been the safe route, but I thought that taking the bishop on c6 was simply better. And after knight takes c6, black chooses not to save their knight, and they choose not to attack my knight in the simple way of queen c7, which I kind of expected, but queen b6, both attacking my knight and defending their knight. And now I realize that this position might not be good for me at all. So the threat right now is simply queen takes knight, and then they could capture on c2 if they wanted. They could also just pile up and attack my knight again, because my knight is trapped right now. I can't go backwards or they capture me, and I can't really go anywhere else. I cannot queenside castle, which would be a nice move here in some positions if I could queenside castle and be able to move my knight backwards and be defended by the rook, but that's impossible since my king is stuck in the center. And so I took a long pause here trying to figure out the best way out of this. If I don't find a good move here, I think they will simply develop their rook, and I'll be pretty stuck. They'll be able to choose to take my knight or take c2 whenever they want. So I end up playing the move king to e2, trying to exploit the fact that the knight is pinned to the queen. And of course, now if the knight moves, I would capture the queen. But in the process, my king is no longer going to be able to castle and is going to be staying in the center. So this move took a lot of thought to make that committal decision, but I thought in the end that was my best option. They take the knight, and originally one of the options I thought I had here was to take with the king, and then my queen would guard c2. But that isn't actually true, because after I take with the king, they would be able to play queen to c5, and I can't run up the board because my queen's undefended. So I'd have to come back, and then they would still take c2, because it would be with check with my king blocking. So after they took on c6, I captured the knight and allowed them to capture on c2, and now black is up a pawn. And after the move queen to d2, I offered a draw. So I thought I was the higher rated player at this point. Time we both had plenty of, but it looked to me like it was going to be pretty easy to trade off the pieces, trade off queens, and then try and trade off rooks and get an opposite color bishop endgame. I didn't think I had any huge weaknesses in this position, so I thought it was a valid offer. I had a tough game earlier in the day. This game wasn't going great, so it was not the worst thing at all if I just called it a day with a draw and got ready for the next day. However, my opponent pretty quickly declined the draw and played the move queen to c5 and decided to start poking at some of my weaknesses around the board. None of them are significant weaknesses, but just weak enough that I have to be careful. So I offer the queen trade again, and they make the move queen to e5, where they're now hitting the b2 pawn, the h2 pawn, and g5 pawn. So their centralized queen is really controlling a lot of space. And I decided on the move queen to c1. The idea here is that I'm creating my own threats, so instead of just trying to defend, I wanted to create some counterplay. If I can make their queen play a bit more of a defensive role, that might be a good thing for me. So threatening this fork on the king and rook, defending the b pawn, and now if the queen captures on h2, I can play rook to g2, attacking the queen and keeping this threat alive. So my opponent plays king to d7, defending against this threat, and I guard my other pawn. So now the trick for black is to increase the pressure in the position. How do they bring their bishop and rooks into the game to perhaps win a second pawn or to further convert their one pawn advantage? And the trick for white is, how do I finish my development? My queen doesn't want to stay on c1 because I need to get the a rook into the game, and my bishop can't even move right now. So if being down a pawn was going to be completely losing, this felt like the kind of position that we were getting close to, where if I'm not careful, the position is going to be lost because I simply can't use all of my pieces. They played bishop to e7, hitting this pawn a second time, keeping my queen tied to it. And I moved my queen to d2, freeing up the c1 square for the rook. And I also attacked the b pawn, but I was never really threatening to capture it. And so my opponent played a5 really fast, and I think that move is probably just not needed. They'll be able to, if I take the b pawn, bring a rook to the b file, and they're going to end up winning the b2 pawn, which looks really dangerous for me. So if they just play a move like rook h to c8, I don't think I can get away with taking this pawn. In addition to the rook going to the b file, they might be able to just play d5. Discovered attack on the queen and opening up the center. So after a5, I play king to d1, opening up my bishop, knowing that if I want a chance to draw this game or possibly win it if things turn around, it's going to involve that bishop playing an active role. In addition, the king on d1 is able to defend the c1 square, so my rook can go there at some point, and I'm staying on a light square since they have a dark squared bishop. So the rook goes to the c file, bishop d3, just developing. Their king goes back. I think a really unnecessary move because the king wasn't in a lot of danger, I don't think. Maybe they were thinking they want to play d5 at this point and get off the d file, but if the pieces come off the board and it becomes an endgame, that king's going to wish it was back on d7. And after this move, I thought, you know what, I might have some chances to be better here. Not just trying to survive for a draw, but actually push for more. So I play f4, chasing the queen. The queen goes to c5, and I play h4. Figure if they're going to commit their king to the king side, I can try and open up some files. We've got the bishop pointed that way, the queen pointed that way, the rook pointed that way. Maybe black has to be careful. And they open with d5. And I think this is the right moment to do that. Maybe they could have done it earlier with even more success. But this distracts me from the king side, and I can't afford to capture this pawn, I don't think. I think that's just going to open the center too much with my king stuck here. So I have to keep it closed with e5. This does attack the h7 pawn, but notice that my pawns are starting to become stuck on dark squares, and they have a dark squared bishop. Even though I'm aiming for that opposite colored bishop endgame, if I keep too many pieces on, or I don't trade things at the right time, their bishop could swoop in and work to start to undermine these pawns, and then I'll be down more than the single pawn. So they play g6, and I offer a queen trade again. At this point, maybe they should keep the queens on, but they trade pretty quickly. They move their king over to f8. I think it's another wasted king move, and I play the move h5. The idea here being that if they capture, I can capture the h-pawn or just go after both h-pawns, and it's just going to create more weaknesses for black. They step up. Capturing is going to allow us to fight on the h-file, but I didn't see that being a big advantage. So I pushed again, and we locked their king out of that side of the board. And now the only advantage black has, if you can call it that, is this passed pawn. I'm going to be able to contest the c file since it's the only open file. So we don't have a situation where there are multiple weaknesses, and as a result, black can't really increase the pressure very easily. So I offer the rook trade. They accept. I offer a second rook trade. They accept. And I thought, okay, this position completely drawn. Nothing to worry about. I make my next few moves a little bit faster than I should, and things get a little bit hairy. So they push. We lock up. I'm trying to keep their king out of getting to the center. They start to go after my pawns. I defend the pawn, and they play the move d4. And I thought, I hope I didn't just ruin things by allowing this check when my bishop is no longer guarding the square in front of it, and my king's tied to this pawn. Fortunately, it didn't matter. But in this position right here, where I knew this was a draw, I should have taken more time to look for any possible tricks my opponent might have. How could they create a position where they might have a tactic that if I don't play well will win them the game? And instead, I just was moving my bishop. I was done with the game, and it was a little bit too early. So I was actually fortunate that this move didn't just lose me the game. So I move and attack the bishop. The bishop moves, and then I have the move king to e4, controlling the square in front of the pawn, attacking the pawn, controlling the d5 square so their king can't get in. And now, even if my bishop is somewhere not doing anything, their king's really going to struggle to get into the game. So they defend their pawn, and they start walking their king up. And now they've got to be careful, because if we can imagine a position where my bishop gets to the e8 square and I start taking these pawns, I'm going to have the fastest pawns. So if black isn't careful here, if they wander too far or push too hard, suddenly white's going to be winning. Unfortunately, black really had no interest in pushing for more, and they don't let my bishop back, and after bishop c4, my opponent offers the draw. And I accept, there's nothing to play for here. So we drew. I felt like I escaped. He played well. He was a real young kid, so he's got a lot of potential. It'll be interesting to see how strong he gets. He's definitely on the upward rise. He played the whole game super fast, so if he slowed down, he probably would have won this game. So I was impressed. I was impressed with his opening, and not impressed with his endgame play, which is often the case with the kids, knowing which endgames to go for or not go for. And so I'm sure if I face him again, I will have to be extra careful because they might not let me save the game like this again. So now I stood at 1.5 out of 3 going into day number 3, round 4. Not super happy with how it's gone so far, but it isn't terrible yet. It's not a disaster. So tomorrow we will see how round 4 goes, and then we'll continue from there in this 7-round tournament. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the support. Good luck in your games, in your studies, and I'll see you next time.